In the autumn of 1883, a young widow bought the hangman's house for $5. The stone fortress had double walls and a deep cellar, built by an executioner terrified of revenge. The town said it was cursed. Lisa moved in. Then she pried open the basement floor and found the confessions of the real killers, proving an innocent man was hanged. That discovery turned the hangman's house into the safest place in town. Lisa was 35 years old and had already buried two husbands. The frontier took her first love to cholera, the second to a sawmill accident. She arrived in Miller's Gulch with nothing but a wagon, a dog, and a refusal to be broken by a town that had already written her off. The house she bought for $5 had stood empty for 7 years. No one would go near it. They said the hangman's ghost still measured rope in the cellar at night. But Lisa saw something else. Solid double stone walls, a cellar deeper than any grave, and a secret the town had tried to bury. She was about to dig it up. The people of Miller's Gulch watched Lisa's wagon roll toward the hangman's house with something between pity and dread. She had the deed in her hand and no man beside her. The dog, a caramel-colored mutt with a crooked ear, trotted alongside the wheel. Nobody came out to greet her. The blacksmith, a man named Crawley who had shod horses for 20 years in that town, paused mid-hammer and stared down the dusty track. His granddaughter clutched his apron and whispered something about the witch house. He didn't correct her. That was the thing about the building that sat at the end of Gable Street, where the road curved sharply toward the creek. It had no need of exaggeration. It earned every fear all on its own. The house had been built by a man named Amos Trask. For 17 years, Trask had served as the official hangman for the territory, a position no one wanted and no one celebrated. He executed horse thieves, claimed jumpers, and one schoolteacher convicted of poisoning his wife. The town paid him a stipend, but never enough to live among them. So he built his house from river stone and mortar mixed with lime, and he built it like a man who believed the dead might come knocking. The walls were nearly 3 feet thick, double-layered with a gap between them that nobody could explain. The cellar was dug 16 feet down, deeper than any root cellar had a right to be. Iron bars crossed the cellar windows, though there were no cellmates to contain. The only thing Amos Trask seemed to be keeping down there was fear itself. 7 years earlier, Trask had been found dead inside that cellar. Not hanged, not shot, simply dead. His heart, the doctor said. But the town knew better. They knew a guilty soul when they saw one. 6 months before his death, Trask had performed his final execution. A young drifter named Clyde Hemmings, who many believed had been wrongly convicted of murdering a ranch hand. Trask pulled the lever. Hemmings dropped. And from that night forward, Amos Trask stopped sleeping. He reinforced the walls. He dug the cellar deeper. He began writing things down in a small leather book that no one ever found. And then he died alone, leaving the house to rot. The town council boarded the windows and left the place empty for 7 years. No squatter ever tried to claim it. No children dared play near its walls. When the wind moved through the gap between the outer and inner stone, the house made a low humming sound. A sound some said was the hangman still whispering his secrets. So when Lisa walked through the front door with nothing but a lantern and a crowbar, the town decided she was either the bravest woman they had ever seen or the most foolish. She had come to Miller's Gulch 2 years earlier with her second husband, a lumberman named Joseph, who promised solid work at the sawmill and a new start after cholera had taken her first. Within 16 months, Joseph was dead, crushed by a green log that rolled off the carriage before the dogs could catch it. The mill owner offered condolences and a $10 settlement. Lisa took the money and buried her second husband on a ridge overlooking the creek. Then she stayed. Not because she had family there or property or prospects. She stayed because leaving would have meant accepting that the frontier had already taken everything it was going to take. And Lisa was not finished. The house cost her $5. The county assessor, a thin man named Holleran who wore spectacles and spoke as if every word cost him money, had laughed when she made the offer. "No one has bid on that property in 7 years," he said. "You could offer $1. She gave him 5. She wanted the price to be remembered. She wanted no question that the house was legally and absolutely hers. Holleran counted the coins slowly. then slid the deed across the desk as if passing a bad luck charm he was happy to lose. The first thing Lisa noticed when she crossed the threshold was the cold. Not the ordinary cold of an empty house in late autumn. This was a deeper chill, the kind that rises from stone that has never felt direct sunlight. The walls were the color of river clay, dark and damp in places where moisture had seeped through the limestone. The floorboards were wide pine planks, scarred from decades of heavy boots. The main room had a fireplace large enough to roast a whole hog, its hearthstone cracked from years of heat. And in the corner, a heavy iron ring set into the floor, the trapdoor to the cellar. She slept upstairs that first night. The second night she slept in the main room by the fire. By the third night she had pulled up 3 floorboards and discovered something that made her blood move faster than fear ever could. The cellar was not a single room. Beneath the trapdoor, a narrow staircase of rough-cut stone descended into darkness. At the bottom, the space opened into a wide chamber with walls that sweated cold moisture. A workbench sat against the eastern wall, covered in dust and the skeletons of old candles. Half-empty jars lined a shelf, pickled eggs, hardened resin, rusted nails. And in the center of the floor, a second trapdoor, locked from the outside with an iron bar that had been bent into place with a hammer. Lisa pried it open on the third afternoon. The space beneath was not another room. It was a small hollow, barely large enough for a man to kneel inside. The walls were lined with cedar planks to keep out moisture. And sitting in the center, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather cord, was a package. She lifted it with trembling hands, not from fear of ghosts, but from the certainty that whatever Amos Trask had hidden this deep was not meant to be found. The oilcloth peeled away to reveal a stack of papers, written in a hand that shook so badly the letters jagged across the page. At the top of the first sheet, in ink that had browned with age, were 3 words: "I confess." The men who killed the rancher were. The rest of the sentence was smeared, but the names below were not. Lisa looked up from the cellar floor, her lantern casting long shadows against the stone walls. The house hummed faintly above her. The dog whined from the top of the stairs. And in that moment, she understood that she was not standing in a cursed house. She was standing inside a man's last attempt to tell the truth before someone silenced him. She read the first name aloud. It was a name everyone in Miller's Gulch knew. The second name made her hands go still. By the third name, she knew she had just inherited a secret that could burn the entire town to the ground. And the men whose names were on that paper were still alive. The first name on the list was Silas Hobart, the town's most prosperous cattle broker. Hobart owned the stockyards, the livery stable, and 3/4 of the freight contracts that kept Miller's Gulch breathing. He sat on the territorial council. His daughter had married a judge in Bismarck. To accuse Silas Hobart of murder was to accuse the town itself. The second name was Ernest Crawley, the blacksmith, the same man who had stared down Gable Street at Lisa's wagon with something darker than pity. Crawley had been in Miller's Gulch since its founding, a man whose hammer had shod every horse ridden by every sheriff in the county. He had been the one to forge the iron bars on Trask's cellar windows. The receipt for that job was still filed in the county ledger, signed by Amos Trask himself. The third name was Nathan Bryce, the undertaker, of course. The man who had prepared Clyde Hemming's body for burial after the hanging. The man who had signed the death certificate. The man who would have known, better than anyone, whether the wounds on the dead ranch hand's body matched the story told in court. 3 men, 3 pillars of Miller's Gulch. And Amos Trask had written down in his own shaking hand that they were the ones who had killed the rancher and let an innocent man swing for it. Lisa read the confession 3 times before she could bring herself to move. The paper was brittle at the edges, and the ink had feathered where dampness had crept through the oilcloth. But the words were clear enough. Trask described a night in the fall of 1875, when Hobart, Crawley, and Bryce had ridden out to the Hendricks Ranch to settle a dispute over water rights. They had gone with guns, not documents. The ranch hand, a boy of 19 named Martin Roach, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw their faces. They could not let him testify. They beat him to death with a branding iron and left his body in the dry creek bed. Then they rode home through the dark and waited. 2 days later, Clyde Hemmings, a drifter who had passed through the ranch that same afternoon, was arrested on suspicion. He had no alibi, no money, and no one to speak for him. The trial lasted 4 hours. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. Amos Trask was ordered to hang the man, and he did, because he was the hangman and that was his duty. But something inside him broke that day, and he started asking questions the town did not want him to ask. Lisa folded the confession carefully and tucked it inside her apron. She climbed the stone steps out of the cellar, closed the trapdoor, and dragged the iron ring back into place. The dog, whose name was Tanner, pressed his nose against her knee and whimpered. She knelt and held his warm head in her hands, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the fur. Then she walked to the front window, pulled back the burlap curtain she had nailed up the day before, and looked out at the town she now knew to be built on the bones of an innocent man. The first knock came 2 days later. It was early evening, and Lisa was reinforcing the kitchen window latch with a strip of scrap iron she had found in Trask's old tool chest. The sound of knuckles against oak echoed through the stone rooms. Tanner growled low and deep. Lisa did not answer immediately. She crossed to the door, stood to one side where the thick wall would shield her, and called through the wood. "Who comes at this hour?" A pause. Then a voice she recognized. The undertaker, Nathan Bryce. His tone was soft and measured, the voice of a man who spent his days comforting widows. "Mrs. Shaw, I heard you'd taken residence here, wanted to welcome you proper, brought bread and a jar of preserves." Lisa opened the door just wide enough to show her face. Bryce stood on the doorstep with a basket in his hands and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was a thin man with long fingers and a habit of tilting his head slightly to one side when he spoke, as if he were always listening for something beyond the conversation. "Thank you, Mr. Bryce," she said, not reaching for the basket. "That's kind." "Hardly kind at all. Town has a responsibility to look after its own." He glanced past her shoulder into the dim interior of the house. The lantern flickered against the stone walls. "Strange place to choose for a woman alone, if you don't mind me saying." "I don't mind," Lisa said. She waited. Bryce's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "They say old Trask kept odd hours, dug that cellar deeper than any sensible man would. You find anything of his down there? Old papers, perhaps?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Lisa felt the weight of the folded papers against her stomach beneath the apron. She looked Bryce directly in the eyes and said, "Nothing but dust and rats, Mr. Bryce, and a lot of bad memories." Bryce held her gaze for a long moment. Then he set the basket down on the stone step and stepped back. "Well, welcome to Miller's Gulch, Mrs. Shaw. We're all praying for your safety." He walked away into the gathering dark. Lisa watched until his long, thin figure disappeared around the bend of Gable Street. Then she picked up the basket, carried it inside, and fed every scrap of that bread to Tanner piece by piece, watching the dog for any sign of sickness. He licked her fingers and wagged his crooked tail. She buried the preserves in the yard behind the goat shed. That night she did not sleep. She sat in the main room with the confession spread on the table before her, reading each line again and again, memorizing the accusations, the dates, the details Trask had recorded. He wrote about the night of the murder with the precision of a man who had spent years documenting death. He had walked the Dry Creek bed himself, weeks after the hanging, and found the branding iron still crusted with dried blood. He had traced the ownership of that iron back to the Hobart stockyards. He had interviewed a stable boy who saw 3 men washing blood from their hands at the livery trough in the hours after the murder. The stable boy had been sent away to Montana the following week, paid in gold coin. But the most damning detail Trask recorded was not a piece of evidence. It was a conversation. 6 months before his death, Silas Hobart had visited this very house. He had sat in the chair beside the fire, accepted a cup of coffee, and told Trask, with the calm of a man discussing livestock prices, that if the hangman ever spoke of what he knew, he would not live to see the next hanging. Amos Trask had written down those exact words, and then he had dug his cellar deeper and reinforced his walls and waited for the men who were coming to kill him. Lisa understood now why the house had felt strange from the moment she entered. It was not haunted by a guilty man's ghost. It was a fortress built by a man who knew he was a target and who had tried desperately to survive long enough to tell the truth. He had not died of a bad heart. He had died of fear, or of something else no one had ever investigated. The second visit came 1 week later in the middle of the night. Lisa woke to the sound of Tanner barking with a fury she had never heard from the gentle dog. She was out of bed in an instant, pulling on her boots, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The dog was at the kitchen window, hackles raised, growling at something moving outside in the dark. Lisa pressed herself against the cold stone wall and peered through a gap in the shutter. Two figures, men from the shape of them, moving low along the outer wall of the house toward the cellar entrance. One carried a crowbar. The other held a dark lantern with its shutter nearly closed, a thin blade of light cutting the darkness. Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She moved through the dark house without making a sound, her bare feet silent on the pine floorboards. She reached the heavy oak bar that braced the front door, checked that it was in place. Then she did something the men outside could not have anticipated. She walked calmly down the stone steps into the cellar, into the deep dark where Amos Trask had hidden his truth, and she waited. The cellar door was heavy iron, and Trask had built its frame from the same thick limestone as the walls. The men outside pried at the exterior hatch for nearly 10 minutes. Lisa could hear the scrape of their crowbar muffled curses, the frustrated slamming of iron against stone. But the hatch did not give. Amos Trask knew how men broke into places, and he had built against it. The hinges were sunk deep into the stone. The bar inside was solid iron, set into brackets that had been forged by Ernest Crawley himself, who must have never imagined his own work would one day protect the evidence of his crime. Eventually, the sound stopped. Boots retreated across the frozen ground. Tanner's barking faded to a low, watchful growl. Lisa remained in the cellar until the first pale light of dawn seeped through the narrow, barred windows. Then she climbed the steps, barred the inner door, and sat down at the kitchen table with the confession spread before her and the iron poker across her knees. She now knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the town leaders of Miller's Gulch had murdered a man, framed an innocent drifter, and conspired to silence the hangman who knew their secret. Second, they knew she was living in Trask's house, and they were afraid of what she might find. Third, she was no longer a widow living in a cursed house. She was a woman who had walked into a fortress and locked the gate behind her. But there was a 4th thing Lisa realized that morning, and it changed the shape of everything that followed. She was not the only person in Miller's Gulch who suspected the truth. During her first week in town, a woman named Cora Moss, whose brother had served on the jury that convicted Clyde Hemmings, had stopped Lisa outside the general store. She had not said much. She had only pressed a folded note into Lisa's hand and whispered, "My brother died 2 winters ago, but before he passed he told me he had nightmares about that trial. He said they were told how to vote." Lisa had forgotten the note in the chaos of moving into the house. Now she found it again, folded into a pocket of her wool coat. The writing was small and cramped. "If you find anything in that house, go to the territorial marshal in Bismarck. Do not trust the sheriff here. Do not trust anyone here." Lisa read the note twice. Then she looked at the confession, at the names written in Trask's shaking hand, and she began to understand something larger than herself. The house was not just a fortress. It was an archive of truth that had been waiting for someone brave enough to open it. And now that she had, the men who had killed to bury that truth were going to come for her again. But this time, she planned to be ready. She spent the next 3 days turning the hangman's house into a citadel. Every window was reinforced with scrap iron and heavy shutters. The exterior hatch to the cellar was barricaded from inside with a second iron bar, one she had found beneath the workbench. She stocked water and dried provisions in the cellar hollow, enough to last a week if necessary. She taught Tanner to alert at the sound of footsteps on the outer gravel, and she hid the confession in a place no one would ever find without tearing the house stone from stone. Inside the gap between the double walls, access through a loose stone behind the hearth that she discovered by accident while cleaning. But she also did something else. She wrote a letter to the territorial marshal in Bismarck, a man named Josiah Crane who had a reputation for honesty. She copied the key passages from Trask's confession, listed the names of the men involved, and described the evidence of the branding iron and the stable boy. She did not send it through the Miller's Gulch post office, which was run by Silas Hobart's nephew. Instead, she gave the letter to a trapper named Elias Crow, who passed through town once a month and who had no loyalty to anyone but the fur trade. She paid him $2 and asked nothing more than to carry the letter north. Elias looked at the address, looked at Lisa's face, and tucked the letter into his coat without a word. Then she waited. The winter settled over Miller's Gulch like a closing fist. The temperature dropped so low that the creek froze solid enough to walk across. Snow began to fall in heavy, silent sheets that buried the wagon tracks and muffled the town in white. The attacks Lisa expected did not come immediately, but she felt the pressure of watchful eyes everywhere she went. Crawley, the blacksmith, stopped speaking when she entered the general store. Hobart's men watched her from the stockyards with cold, expressionless faces. And Nathan Bryce, the undertaker, began to visit the houses of her neighbors, asking questions about her habits, her past, her dead husbands. One afternoon, a boy delivered a note to her door. It was unsigned. It read only, "Leave before the spring thaw or you won't leave at all." Lisa folded the note and placed it with the confession behind the hearthstone. Then she went outside into the biting wind and continued reinforcing the goat shed. The storm was coming. She could feel it building in the silence between the gusts, the same silence Amos Trask must have felt in the years before his death. But unlike the hangman, Lisa was not alone in the dark with her fear. She had a dog who loved her, a fortress built by a man who had tried to protect the truth, and the truth itself, written in ink that would not fade. And she had made a decision that would change everything. If the marshal did not arrive before the men came for her again, she would walk into the town square on a Sunday morning when the church doors opened and read Amos Trask's confession aloud to every soul in Miller's Gulch. Let them stone her if they dared. She had already buried 2 husbands. She was not afraid to bury a town's secrets with her. But the men had not been idle while Lisa fortified her walls. They had been watching, planning, and waiting for their moment. And their moment was about to come from a direction Lisa had never considered. It would not come through the barred windows or the iron cellar hatch. It would come through the town's only doctor, a man she had never met, who would arrive at her door in the middle of a blizzard with a story she desperately wanted to believe. The blizzard arrived on the last Friday of January, not with gentle warnings, but with a wall of white so dense that Lisa could not see the goat shed from the kitchen window. Wind screamed through the gap between the double stone walls, making the house hum its low, mournful note. She had barred every shutter, stacked firewood inside the dead air space between the cedar posts she had planted along the porch, and moved Tanner's bed into the main room beside the hearth. The confession sat behind its stone, silent and waiting. She believed she was ready for anything the storm could throw at her. She was wrong. The knock came at midnight, muffled by the howl of wind but unmistakable. 3 sharp raps, then 3 more. Tanner launched toward the door with a snarl that rattled his whole body. Lisa lifted the iron poker and stood to the side of the door as she had done before. Through the wood, a voice called out, thin and desperate against the storm. "Mrs. Shaw, my name is Dr. Halstead. I have information about Amos Trask. Please, I've walked through this blizzard to reach you." Lisa did not open the door. "What kind of information?" A pause. She heard coughing, a man's deep, wet cough that sounded genuinely racked from the cold. "I treated Trask in the final months of his life. I know what's in his confession because I was there when he wrote it, and I can tell you that the men whose names are on those papers are innocent. Trask was not in his right mind." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. For weeks, she had held the confession as absolute truth. Now a man she had never met was telling her the hangman was delusional. The possibility was not one she had allowed herself to consider. What if Amos Trask had been mad? What if she had been hiding inside a fortress built by a paranoid, waiting for an attack from men who were guilty of nothing except frightening a sick old man? She lifted the bar and opened the door just wide enough to see the man on her step. Dr. Halstead was somewhere past 50, with a thin white beard crusted in ice, spectacles fogged into blindness, and a wool coat so heavy with snow it looked like he wore the storm itself. His hands trembled, and his lips were blue. Everything about him suggested a man who had nearly died to deliver this message. "Come in," Lisa said, stepping back. The doctor stumbled through the doorway, and she rebarred the door behind him. Tanner pressed against her leg, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. Dr. Halstead stood before the fire while Lisa hung his coat to dry. He accepted a cup of hot water but did not drink it. Instead, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of a man who had been holding a terrible secret for too long. "I was the one who found Amos Trask's body," he began. "In the cellar." His heart had stopped, but that wasn't what killed him. What killed him was 7 years of being consumed by a delusion that wouldn't let him sleep. He told her a story that made terrible, logical sense. Trask had been a hangman for 17 years, executing men across the territory. The guilt of that work, combined with isolation and the slow poisoning of loneliness, had broken something inside his mind. He began to believe that every man he had hanged was innocent. He started seeing conspiracies in ordinary events. When Clyde Hemmings was convicted of murdering the ranch hand, Trask convinced himself the real killers were town leaders. He named names based on grudges, not evidence. Hobart had once cheated him on a cattle deal. Crawley had overcharged for the cellar bars. Bryce had refused to bury a favorite dog. Trask twisted these ordinary disputes into proof of murder. "I tried to reason with him," Halstead said, his voice cracking. "I brought him medicine to help him sleep. I sat with him through the nights when he swore he heard men digging under his walls, but the delusion only grew stronger. He wrote that confession not as a record of truth, but as a symptom of his disease. And when he died, the truth should have died with him." Lisa stared into the fire. This explanation was exactly what she had secretly feared. She was a widow twice over, alone in a strange town, and she had convinced herself she had uncovered a vast conspiracy. Perhaps she had been the fool all along. Perhaps the men who had come to her door, the night intruders, were simply townspeople worried about a madwoman living in a hangman's cursed house, spreading dangerous accusations. Dr. Halstead reached into his medical bag, a worn leather satchel he had set beside his chair. Lisa's eyes followed his hand without conscious thought. He withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. "This was Trask's," he said. "I found it in the cellar after his death. I should have burned it, but I kept it as a reminder of what guilt does to the mind. Read it yourself. You'll see the descent." Lisa took the notebook. The handwriting matched the confession, but the contents were different. Fragments of nightmares, sketches of gallows, pages of rambling about shadows that moved through walls. It read like the journal of a man losing his grip on reality. Then something shifted in Lisa's perception. She noticed a detail that did not fit. The doctor's coat, hanging by the fire, had a button carved from pale wood, not the horn buttons common on frontier garments. It was carved with a tiny symbol, a brand that looked like a letter H inside a circle. The Hobart Stockyard brand. She had seen it on the gate of the cattle pens, stamped into fence posts throughout town. The realization moved through her body like a lightning strike. She did not let her face change. She kept her voice steady. "You said you treated him for how long?" "From the summer of '75 until his death," Halstead replied, warming his hands. "I visited him twice a week." Lisa nodded slowly. She turned a page in the notebook. "That's odd," she said, "because Amos Trask wrote in his confession that the stable boy who witnessed the murder was sent away with gold coin. And he recorded the name of that boy. It was Samuel Halstead. That's your son, isn't it, doctor?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Dr. Halstead's trembling stopped. His face, which had been the picture of exhausted concern, became utterly still. The transformation was like watching a mask melt away, revealing the bare stone beneath. "Your son saw 3 men washing blood from their hands the night of the Hendricks murder," Lisa continued, her voice quiet and steady, the way she had spoken to her dying husbands when the end was near. "He told Trask what he saw. So the men who did the killing paid you to silence your own boy. You sent him to Montana with Hobart's gold, and you've been covering for them ever since. Then Trask kept digging, and you were sent to stop him. Only he didn't have a bad heart, did he? You made sure of that." Halstead's hand moved toward his medical bag again, but not toward the notebook this time. Toward the leather side pocket where a shape bulged that was too heavy to be medicine. Lisa was faster. She had not survived 2 husbands and a winter alone in a hostile town by waiting for men to make their moves. She swung the iron poker hard into the side of his wrist before his fingers could close on the gun. Bone crunched. Halstead screamed and dropped the bag, the revolver spilling out onto the floorboards. Tanner lunged forward and clamped his jaws around the doctor's ankle, dragging him off the chair. The man crashed to the ground, clutching his shattered wrist, while Lisa stood over him with the poker raised. "You came here to kill me and take the confession," she said, "but you made one mistake. You assumed I wanted to believe your story more than I wanted to know the truth. I don't." She bound him with rope from the woodpile and dragged him into the cellar hollow, the same deep hole where Trask had hidden his confession. She barred the inner trapdoor and left him in the darkness with his shattered hand and his lies. But the doctor's arrival had been only the first move in a coordinated assault. While Lisa had been occupied with Halstead's performance, Ernest Crawley and Nathan Bryce had been crouching in the blizzard against the east wall of the house, clearing snow from a small iron hatch that was half buried in the foundation. The hatch led to a coal chute that Amos Trask had sealed years ago, or so everyone believed. But Crawley had built that chute himself, and he had constructed it with a hidden release mechanism that only he knew. A particular sequence of pressure on the rusted hinges and the bar inside dropped free. Lisa heard the grinding of metal from the cellar. She froze at the top of the stone steps. Tanner growled, his hackles raised toward the darkness below. Then she heard boots on the cellar floor, 2 sets of them moving toward the inner stairs. Crawley's voice drifted up, low and rough. "Find the woman, find the papers, don't leave anything that can talk." She had seconds. The men were inside her fortress. The same double walls and deep cellar that had protected her were now a trap. Crawley knew every inch of this house because he had helped build it. He knew the gap between the walls, the hidden storage spaces, the single narrow staircase that led up from the cellar with no other exit. Lisa could not flee into the blizzard. She would freeze before she reached the next house. She could not barricade the trapdoor because the bolt was on the underside, designed to keep people out of the cellar, not in. But there was something Crawley did not know. In the months before his death, Amos Trask had made one final modification to his fortress. Behind the hearthstone where Lisa had hidden the confession, a narrow passage led into the gap between the double walls. Trask had built it as an escape route, a slim crawl space that ran the perimeter of the house and emerged through a hidden door in the goat shed. The passage was barely wide enough for a grown man. For a woman of Lisa's build, it would be tight but possible. She grabbed the confession from behind the hearthstone, tucked it inside her dress, and whistled once to Tanner. The dog followed her without hesitation. She squeezed through the narrow opening behind the hearth, pulling the stone back into place behind her just as boots thudded onto the main floor above. The space between the walls was pitch black and cold as a grave. She crawled on her belly through decades of dust and cobwebs, the rough stone scraping her shoulders, the dog panting behind her. The wind howled through the gap, the same sound that had terrified the town for years, and now it masked the noise of her escape. She moved inch by inch, following the wall until her fingers touched the wooden panel that marked the shed entrance. She pushed through and tumbled into the goat shed, gasping in the frozen air. The blizzard still raged outside, but the shed was sheltered, her goats bleating nervously in the dark. Through the shed wall, she could hear shouting from inside the house. Crawley and Bryce had discovered the empty cellar and were tearing the place apart. Lisa knew she could not run. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away through deep drifts and whiteout. She had no gun, only the iron poker. But she had something the men did not have. She had the confession, and she had a house that a paranoid hangman had designed to be a weapon. Trask had built the double walls not just for defense, but to channel sound. Every whisper in the cellar could be heard through the stone vents he had installed near the chimney. And there was one more thing he had left behind, sitting in a locked chest in the goat shed that she had found the previous week but never opened. She broke the lock with the poker. Inside the chest lay 6 sticks of blasting powder, carefully wrapped in oilskin, along with a length of fuse. Amos Trask had been prepared for a siege he never lived to fight. Lisa had never used explosives in her life. She was a farmer's daughter, a widow who had spent her years mending fences and canning preserves. But the frontier teaches you to learn fast or die. She returned to the house through the crawl space, moving silently through the wall passage while Crawley and Bryce tore through the rooms above. She knew exactly where they were by the sound of their boots. She stopped beneath a section of floorboards that creaked in a pattern she had memorized during her long nights alone. The boards were directly above the cellar stairs, the only way up or down between the levels. She worked quickly in the darkness, wedging 2 sticks of powder beneath the floor joists with the fuse trailing down the passage. She had no idea if it would collapse the stairs or bring the whole house down. She only knew that the men hunting her had built their lives on burying the truth, and she was done hiding. She crawled back to the shed, lit the fuse from the ember of her tinderbox, and pressed herself against the frozen ground with Tanner beside her. The explosion ripped through the house like a thunderclap. The staircase collapsed inward, cutting off the only exit from the cellar to the main floor. Crawley and Bryce, who had been upstairs, were now trapped with no way down to the hidden passages below. And the cellar, the place they had entered through the coal chute, was sealed beneath rubble. The blizzard raged on, and inside the hangman's house, 2 of the men who had murdered an innocent drifter and silenced the man who knew the truth were now caged inside the very fortress they had come to destroy. They were not dead. They were not even injured. But they were trapped, with no food, no water, and no way to call for help while the storm howled and the temperature plummeted. Lisa sat in the goat shed, the confession clutched against her chest, and watched the house through the swirling snow. The doctor was bound in the deep hollow. The blacksmith and the undertaker were sealed upstairs. And somewhere out in the blizzard, Silas Hobart was waiting to learn that his plan had failed again. But what Hobart did not yet understand was that Lisa was no longer hiding. When the storm broke and the town dug itself out of the snow, she would walk into the town square with the confession in her hand and the truth on her tongue. And this time, she would not be alone. Because while the men had been hunting her, something had been shifting in Miller's Gulch. The bread she had refused to eat, the preserves she had buried, the note from Cora Moss, the story spread by a trapper named Elias Crow before he vanished, all of it had planted seeds. Neighbors who had kept silent for years were beginning to talk. A minister who had preached over the grave of Clyde Hemmings was beginning to ask questions he should have asked long ago. And the territorial marshal, Josiah Crane, had not been killed en route. He had gone underground, waiting for his moment. The hangman's house had been a tomb for secrets, but the blizzard that Lisa weathered that night transformed it into something else entirely. It became a crucible, and when dawn finally broke over the frozen plains, the truth that Amos Trask had buried in a hole beneath the floorboards would finally see the light. Dawn came pale and silent over the frozen plains. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a world buried so deep in white that rooftops looked like small islands rising from an endless sea. Lisa opened the goat shed door and stepped into snow that reached her thighs. Tanner bounded ahead, breaking a path toward the house. The air was so still she could hear the distant creak of a wagon axle somewhere in town, the first sign of life after 3 days of isolation. The hangman's house still stood. Smoke had stopped rising from the chimney hours ago, but the walls were intact. The explosion that collapsed the cellar stairs had cracked 2 floorboards on the main level and sent dust raining into every corner, but the double stone walls had absorbed the shock the way they had absorbed everything. Lisa circled the house slowly, checking for tracks. The coal chute was still open, half buried in drifted snow. She dragged a heavy timber across it and wedged it tight between 2 stones. Then she cupped her hands around her mouth and called through the kitchen window. "Crawley, Bryce, you're alive. I'll send the marshal for you. Don't try the floor in the main room unless you want to join the doctor in the deep hole." No answer came, only the sound of shuffling feet upstairs. She did not need an answer. The men were trapped and they would wait until justice arrived. By mid-morning the town was digging itself out. Men with wide wooden shovels cleared paths between buildings. Women hung frozen blankets to dry in the pale sunlight. Children dragged sleds loaded with firewood through the lanes. Lisa walked down Gable Street for the first time in weeks, her boots crunching on packed snow, the confession folded against her chest. Tanner walked beside her, his crooked ear perked forward. The dog had not left her side since the explosion, and he would not leave her now. She stopped first at the church. The minister, a young man named Ellsworth who had come from Ohio only 2 years before, was shoveling snow from the front steps. He looked up when he saw her, and something in her face made him set the shovel aside without a word. She handed him the confession. "Read it," she said. "Then ring the bell." Reverend Ellsworth read the first page, then the second, then the third. His face went pale. He sat down heavily on the church step as if the weight of the words had physically struck him. "This is the truth?" he asked. "I have the doctor bound in the cellar who tried to kill me to cover it up," Lisa said. "The blacksmith and the undertaker are trapped in the house right now. They came through the coal chute during the blizzard to finish what they started 7 years ago. I have the stable boy's name. I have the branding iron's location, hidden in Crawley's forge behind the bellows. Amos Trask recorded everything." The minister stood up, walked into the church, and began pulling the bell rope with both hands. The iron bell rang out across the frozen town, a sound that carried over the rooftops and down every buried street. Doors opened. Faces appeared. And by the time the bell fell silent, half of Miller's Gulch had gathered in the square, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the woman standing beside the church steps with a stack of yellowed papers in her hand. Silas Hobart was among them. He had been coordinating the town's recovery efforts from the stockyard office when the bell began to ring. He walked into the square with the confident stride of a man who had never been challenged in his life. He was flanked by two of his freight drivers, large men with bullhide coats and expressions of casual menace. When he saw Lisa holding the papers, his stride did not falter. He simply smiled, the same smile he had given 100 business deals. "Mrs. Shaw," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "You've had a difficult few days. We've all been worried. Perhaps you should rest before you say something you'll regret." Lisa looked at him and felt no fear. She had buried 2 husbands. She had survived a blizzard inside a fortress built by a dead man. She had crawled through walls and lit explosives and stared down a doctor who tried to poison her with lies. Silas Hobart was just a man who had never been told no. "I regret nothing," she said, and she began to read. She read about the water rights dispute that had sent 3 men riding to the Hendricks Ranch on a night in September of 1875. She read about the ranch hand, a boy named Martin Roach, who had seen their faces by lantern light. She read about the branding iron, still crusted with dried blood, that Amos Trask had found in the Dry Creek bed, and how he had traced its mark back to the Hobart stockyards. She read the name of Samuel Halstead, the stable boy who had witnessed 3 men washing blood from their hands at the livery trough and who had been sent to Montana with gold coin, and a threat against his family if he ever returned. She read the exact words Silas Hobart had spoken to Amos Trask in front of this very fireplace. "If you ever speak of what you know, you will not live to see the next hanging." When she finished, the square remained silent. Not a single voice rose in defense of the accused men. The freight drivers beside Hobart had stepped back, their faces uncertain. The minister was weeping. Cora Moss, the woman who had passed Lisa the note weeks ago, stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears freezing on her cheeks. The people of Miller's Gulch were not looking at Lisa. They were looking at Silas Hobart, and what they saw in his face was not outrage or denial. It was the cold calculation of a man trying to find an exit that no longer existed. Hobart's hand moved toward his coat. Lisa saw the gesture and knew what it meant. But before his fingers could close on whatever was hidden there, a new voice cut through the silence from the edge of the square. "Don't!" Territorial Marshal Josiah Crane stepped out from behind the general store with 4 deputies at his back. He was a tall man with a scarred jaw and eyes that had seen too many guilty men try to run. In his hand was a warrant, signed by a federal judge in Bismarck 4 days earlier. Beside him stood a young man in his mid-twenties with the same sharp features as the doctor. Samuel Halstead, the stable boy, now a grown man, had come home to testify. Crane walked through the parted crowd and stopped directly in front of Hobart. Silas Hobart, you are under arrest for the murder of Martin Roach, the wrongful execution of Clyde Hemmings, and conspiracy to murder Amos Trask. You will lower your hand and you will come quietly, or I will have my deputies carry you to the wagon in chains." Hobart looked at the marshal, then at the crowd that had once feared him, then at the woman who had unraveled everything. His hand fell to his side. He said nothing as the deputies closed around him and escorted him away toward the jail wagon that had been waiting behind the livery stable. The rest unfolded quickly. Ernest Crawley and Nathan Bryce were brought out of the hangman's house by the marshal's men, blinking in the harsh winter light. Their hands were bound. Their faces carried the hollow shock of men who had believed they were untouchable. Dr. Halstead was carried up from the cellar hollow on a stretcher, his shattered wrist splinted, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The four men were transported to Bismarck for trial, along with the confession, the branding iron found in Crawley's forge exactly where Lisa said it would be, the testimony of Samuel Halstead, and the letter from Cora Moss's dead brother. All four were convicted. Silas Hobart and Ernest Crawley were sentenced to hang for murder. Nathan Bryce received life imprisonment for conspiracy and perjury, having falsified the death certificate of both Martin Roach and Amos Trask. Dr. Halstead, in exchange for his full confession, received 20 years. He admitted to administering a slow poison to Amos Trask over several months, a compound of mercury that mimicked the symptoms of heart failure. Trask had known he was being poisoned, and he had used his remaining time to bury the truth where his killers could never find it. Clyde Hemmings' body was exhumed from the pauper's grave behind the stockyard and reinterred in the town cemetery beneath a proper stone. Reverend Ellsworth spoke the words that should have been spoken 7 years earlier. The entire town attended. Even the freight drivers who had worked for Hobart stood with their hats in their hands, and the hangman's house, the cursed fortress at the end of Gable Street, slowly began to change in the minds of the people who had feared it for so long. Lisa repaired the damaged stairs and sealed the coal chute permanently. She kept the confession in a locked box, but she made a copy and gave it to the Territorial Archive in Bismarck so the record would never be lost. The house itself, with its double stone walls and deep cellar, its hidden passages and its capacity to shelter against any storm, became a refuge, not just for her but for anyone in need. During the next winter, which arrived early and hit even harder than the one before, 3 travelers were caught on the road north of Miller's Gulch when a sudden blizzard closed off the trail. They stumbled toward the only light visible through the whiteout, a lantern burning in the window of the house on Gable Street. Lisa opened the door, brought them inside, and fed them stew from the iron pot beside the fire. They slept on pallets in the main room while the wind howled through the stone gap outside, and in the morning they woke to find the house still warm, still safe, still standing. The storm had exhausted itself against the walls that Amos Trask had built, unable to find a way through. Word spread. Before long, the house became known as Trask's Haven, a waypoint for travelers and a shelter during storms. The town that had once crossed the street to avoid its shadow now sent supplies and firewood to help maintain it. Lisa lived there for the rest of her years, never remarrying, never leaving. Tanner grew old and gray beside the hearth, and every winter, when the first snow began to fall, someone in Miller's Gulch would look toward Gable Street and see the lantern burning, and they would know that the house the hangman built to protect a secret had become the house that protected everyone else. There was one more thing. In the spring after the trial, while Lisa was resealing the hollow in the cellar floor, she found a second package wedged into a crevice she had missed the first time. It was a letter from Amos Trask, written the week before his death, addressed to no one and everyone. It read, "To whoever finds this, I did not deserve your kindness, but I hope this house gives you the safety it could not give me. Sometimes a prison built for one becomes a shelter for many. That is the only redemption I can offer." Beneath the letter was a small pouch containing $40 in gold coin, the savings of a hangman who had spent his final days knowing he would never spend it. Lisa used the money to install a new iron stove in the main room, one large enough to heat the entire house during the coldest nights. She never spoke of the gold to anyone, but she kept the letter framed beside the hearth. And every time the wind moved through the gap between the double walls, making that low hum that had once terrified the town, Lisa would look up from her work and smile, because the sound was no longer a ghost's lament. It was the voice of a fortress that had finally fulfilled its purpose, protecting not a secret, but a truth that had set a town free. The story of Lisa Shaw and the Hangman's House could easily be dismissed as frontier legend, one more tale whispered around stove fires during long Dakota winters. But it is not legend. The trial transcripts exist, filed in the Territorial Archive in Bismarck. The confession of Dr. Halstead, the testimony of Samuel Halstead, the branding iron pulled from Crawley's forge, all of it was recorded, sworn, and preserved. Amos Trask wrote his final words in a cellar hollow, believing he was writing for a future that might never come. Lisa Shaw read those words and chose to become that future. The question that lingers is not whether the story happened. It is why it almost stayed buried forever. Miller's Gulch was not uniquely evil. It was a town made of ordinary people who preferred the comfort of a lie over the danger of a truth. A drifter was easy to scapegoat. A hangman was easy to isolate. A widow was supposed to be easy to silence, but the town miscalculated. They assumed that fear was stronger than courage, that stone walls could keep secrets contained, that a woman who had already lost everything would be afraid to lose more. They forgot that someone who has buried two husbands has already faced the worst that life can offer and decided to keep living anyway. The Hangman's House still stands. It has been more than a century, and the double walls have settled but not crumbled. The cedar windbreak Lisa planted around the property in her later years still bends the prairie gusts into softer currents. Travelers still stop there, now a historical waypoint with a small plaque that tells the story in polite, abbreviated language. The plaque does not mention the blasting powder. It does not mention the doctor's shattered wrist or the sound of the bell ringing across the frozen square. It simply says that in 1883, a widow bought the house for $5 and uncovered the truth behind a wrongful hanging. Polite language for an impolite story. But the house does not need the plaque to tell its history. When the winter wind moves through the gap between the outer and inner stone, the low hum still rises. Some hear it as the house breathing. Others hear it as a reminder that the safest places are often the ones built by people who knew exactly what they were afraid of and decided to face it anyway. Amos Trask built a prison for his guilt and discovered it was a refuge for his truth. Lisa Shaw walked into a cursed house and found a fortress already prepared. Both of them understood something that the town took years to learn. You cannot bury the truth forever. It waits beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth, until someone brave enough comes down the stone steps to find it. So the next time you hear a story about a place too frightening to enter, or a secret too dangerous to speak aloud, ask yourself what else that story might be hiding. Sometimes a prison built for one becomes a shelter for many. Sometimes a $5 house contains a truth worth more than everything the town tried to protect. And sometimes, the only person standing between a buried injustice and the light of day is a woman with a dog, a crowbar, and the stubborn refusal to be afraid any longer. Subscribe now and witness the next remarkable true story that history tried to forget.